Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. Hopefully some of the other members of the gang will be here. Otherwise, we know that there are people online. Welcome to you, too. This is our fourth session out of 5. So we have another great evening planned together. And like we've been doing for the last few weeks at least, we're going to begin by singing a hymn. And there are fewer people here, so that means you're going to sing probably 3 times louder than you normally do. So we have been singing some of the great hymns of the faith that come out of England, and this hymn is by the famous hymn writer Isaac Watts. Isaac Watts was born, he's a 17th century figure most of his life, and then he started out as a child who showed tremendous promise. People recognized right away. He was 8 years old. He was writing verse, and he was learning Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, even in his childhood. So he became a part of an esteemed grammar school, and early on, the elders recognized his incredible intellectual capacity, so they were trying to make arrangements for him to get into one of the great English universities, but he refused because he was a nonconformist. So he was a nonconformist. So by this time, and a little bit after this, you were allowed to practice your Christianity outside of the Church of England. And so this group of people that are just at least loosely called nonconformists were people who just did not want to conform to the Church of England, thinking, in most cases, I think, that they hadn't gone far enough with the Reformation. Anyway, so in 1702, he was ordained a pastor and pastored an eminent independent congregation, but had horrible health problems that eventually took his life. But during his lifetime, he was awarded an honorary Doctor of Divinity from Edinburgh University. And maybe if we look really carefully when we go into Westminster Abbey, we will find the monument to him, because he is recognized for his influence, especially in hymnody. He wrote somewhere between 600 and 750 hymns. But just wait till you meet Charles Wesley. Anyway, Isaac Watts wrote Joy to the World. He wrote, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, I Sing the Mighty Power of God, etc., etc., etc. But tonight, we are going to sing, O God, Our Help in Ages Past. And Janine and Brandon and I have finally figured out how to coordinate all the right words together. So they are projected for us, and I think there are 4 verses, 1, 2, 3, 5. So let's sing it out. And then we will pray.
Our hope for you. is our eternal home.
Thank you, Janine. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for the truth of these words, for the fact that you are God and have always been God and will always be God, and you are the same yesterday and today and forever. And even as we look back on the story of the things you have done past the time of the Bible and the story of the growth of the church and the development of the church against all the obstacles, not just from outside the church, but from within the church itself, we recognize your great faithfulness. And we recognize your great faithfulness tonight as you continue to guide us and lead us into a greater awareness of what it means to be your followers. Thank you so much for our guest tonight, and we ask your blessing on him as we gather and as we listen and as we learn and as we are stretched to be more capable of being filled with the Spirit who wants to use us and develop us and grow us and stretch us to be the witnesses that you call us to be. And so we ask for this in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. So we do have a guest tonight, and this is the second week we have a guest. And this guest also is from Westmont College, and he is Alistair Chapman. I almost said Alistair McGrath. No, I almost said Alistair McGrath, but that's a different Alistair. Alistair Chapman. Alistair was born and raised in England, as you'll find out in a moment. And he studied for his undergraduate degree at Cambridge and his doctoral degree at Cambridge. He has been teaching at Westmont since 2004. Is that right? And he is a history professor. So he is a member of the Royal Historical Society and teaches modern European history and world history and probably a whole bunch of other things too, historical. So it's great to have Dr. Chapman here tonight, and so let's give him a warm welcome.
Hello, is that better? Well, lovely to be here with you. Thank you so much, Eric, for the warm welcome. There were no lies in that introduction. So glad to see that speaking the truth is part of the values of this church. And it's good to see some old friends here as well. And hello to those of you who are online. We've had all sorts of people who we've known and loved over the years who've come to this congregation, so it's lovely to be with you. I'll tell you the one thing that I am appreciating the most about your church at the moment, which you may not even know is wonderful, and I just want to make you aware of it, is the punctuation. Basically, every church uses slides these days. And the only punctuation that those slides typically employ is the full stop or the period. Isaac Watts, when he wrote his hymns, he would have used commas, especially the occasional semicolon, to help you understand the meaning and to know how to sing it and when to pause and so on. So I'm glad that Community Covenant is holding on to commas, among other things. There was a ditty that I was taught once about Isaac Watts, that before his day, the church more typically sang psalms, and he wanted to compose his own verses rather than just singing the psalms. And his father, stern man, was opposed to this, and so gave Isaac a sound thrashing. At which Isaac said, "Oh, Father, please do mercy take, and I will no more verses make." I don't know whether that's true, but it's one of those stories, the thrashing aside, that I hope is true. But lovely to be with you. I'm hoping that this evening will have 3 parts. The first part, I'm just going to give those of you who are traveling my 10 top tips for visiting Britain as a foreigner. And you can leave after that if you wish. Second part will be some of the history, and Pastor Eric has asked me to speak about Christianity in England since the Reformation, with a special emphasis on the present day. And then thirdly, we should have some time for questions, unless I rattle on for too long, which is always a danger. So we'll just see how it goes. But I have my watch here, so hopefully we won't run out of time. But without further ado, here are some tips. How many of you are actually going on the trip, just so I know? Okay, excellent. How many of you have not been to England before? Okay, so quite a few. Super. Okay, so here are 10 tips from an Englishman about traveling to Britain. You ready? Number 1, be careful crossing the street. When you cross the street in the United States, you go like that. If you do that in England, you may get hit. Okay, you need to do this, because the traffic will be coming from the other directions. If you're in London, they actually have friendly reminders on the street, look left, look right. But I don't think you're starting in London, and so you need to figure that out before you get to London. So be careful crossing the street. Secondly, spend lots of time in churches and pubs. One of the things that England has in abundance that the United States does not have is very old buildings. And you could be in some tiny village in the middle of nowhere, which is off the map. It's not in any of the guidebooks. And you have a church from the 14th century and a pub from the 16th century. So don't go to the shops. Just spend as much time as you can in churches and pubs. And even if you're not a committed drinker, pubs are definitely still a good place to go because, 1, they serve soft drinks. 2, rarely do you see people inebriated. 3, they often have very good food. Pubs aren't always a great place for me because the old ones in particular typically have low ceilings, which is a bit of a danger for me. So if you are tall, beware. But generally, churches and pubs are tremendous places to visit in any English town that you go to. My mother recently moved within my hometown of Derby, about 10 miles down the road. And there's this tiny little parish church in this village called Aston-on-Trent, and nobody cares about it. It's just there. It still has services, but parts of this church go back 1,000 years, and most of it goes back more than 600. It's just this incredible structure in the middle of the town. Typically these churches will have little guides, and you can see what was from which period. Often, like this campus, they've been developed over time. But pubs and churches, definitely places you should go as much as possible. Thirdly, just remember that when you're visiting the UK, as with any country, there are going to be pluses and minuses. So there are going to be things that you're going to be tempted to grumble about, as there would be for British people coming to the United States. But there are other things that you can be grateful for. So whenever you're tempted to be grumble, just remember to be grateful too. So you're sitting in your hotel room in the evening and it's a little bit more cramped than you might prefer, and it doesn't have air conditioning. However, the roads that you've just traveled on to get there will almost certainly not have troubled your lumbar sciatica problems because of the unevenness of the road surface, and you may even have had the pleasure of going on a train on public transport and that being delightful as well. So you have to spend your money somewhere. Britain spends it in slightly different places than the United States. So just lean into the things which are good and different rather than things that are bad and different. Fourthly, I don't know what the weather forecast is. It's been an unseasonably warm summer. But Britain, like most places, and unlike Santa Barbara, has varied types of weather on a regular basis. So do make sure that you take a proper raincoat or an umbrella and some waterproof-ish shoes, okay? They don't have to be hardcore hiking boots with a Gore-Tex lining and blah, blah, blah. A normal pair of leather shoes in decent repair will do you just fine. I doubt that Eric is going to make you stand out in the rain for long periods of time, but you may get caught in a shower, so just make sure you have something that will keep the water off you and keep your socks dry. Because as soon as you get wet socks, I feel as though one's mood goes downhill pretty quickly. Again, don't need to go to REI and spend $600. You probably have what you need in your cupboard at home. Fifthly, don't worry. Okay? Occasionally we have visitors who come from England and they're like, are we going to get shot? Because, they hear about gun crime in the United States and they're like, I'm lying in my bed at Alistair's house and, somebody going to point a gun through the window, right? Obviously unlikely to happen. You may have heard horror stories about people being mugged in Europe. You're going to be fine, almost certainly. If it's after dark, be a little bit more careful in the same way that you would be if you were walking through Los Angeles here. And if you're in a big city, be a little bit more careful. If you're in a large group that's really packed together, you may also want to keep your wits about you. But you should be fine, okay? So don't kind of go with the siege mentality, feeling as though there are criminals at every corner who are out to get you, because there aren't. So don't worry, be sensible, enjoy your time there. Don't be paranoid. Sixthly, buy lots of chocolates and biscuits and Tayto crisps. If you have a sweet tooth, the biscuits or cookies in England are very different than they are here. They're also much cheaper typically. So just go into a supermarket, into a Sainsbury's or Tesco's, and grab a packet of custard creams or bourbon biscuits or home wheats or hobnobs or something like that. Very different kind of selection of sweet treats to eat. Or if you're in a newsagent's, convenience store, just kind of go look and you'll see things which look similar, like Mars bars and M&Ms. Don't have them. Find the ones that you haven't seen before. If you're not peckish at the moment, pick one up, put it in your bag, and have it later. Tayto Crisps, T-A-Y-T-O, is for those of you who are going to Ireland. Who's going to Ireland? Some of you are going to Ireland, yes? Tayto Crisps are, they're an Irish national institution. You've all heard of Guinness. Tayto Crisps are much better for your health than Guinness. I particularly recommend the cheese and onion Tayto Crisps, not least because they were the first flavored crisps, or chips as you call them, in the world. The Irish are the first ones to figure out how to make, some of you are probably old enough, you remember when you used to get a little salt packet inside and you tore it open and shook it in your bag? Remember that? Tayto were the first people to figure out how you didn't need to do that, and they figured out how to make the first flavored crisps, which were cheese and onion. So have some Tayto cheese and onions. You'll find them at every street corner. If you're looking for nice gifts to bring home to people, if you're in Ireland, you want to look for Avoca, A-V-O-C-A, which is like a woolen mill, and they make throws and blankets in wonderfully creative colors, still made there in Ireland. So Avoca, and there are other mills and so on which still operate in Ireland, but AVOCA is a great place. If you're in England, or if you're like at the airport and you're like, oh shoot, I meant to get something for Auntie Marjorie and I forgot, there's a wonderful London shop called Fortnum and Mason. Fortnum and Mason. It's this kind of duck egg blue color. They make very nice tea and coffee and chocolates. They're a very kind of English gift to bring home for friends and relatives. Also, the location of one of my father's favorite stories. Fortnum and Mason is a shop on Piccadilly in London. And the ground floor, which is large, is like completely chocolate tea, coffee, and things. And then they have a tea room at the back. If you like going for a fancy tea, and are you in London? You are in London. Fortnum and Mason is the place to go. And then there's kind of 3 other department store-ish floors above. Anyway, there was this chap who was there in the 1930s, and he's in the queue behind this woman. And he knows her. You know this happens too. He knows her, but he can't quite place her. And he's just, it's really frustrating him. So he decides he has to figure out who this woman is. So he goes up to her and says, afternoon, madam, how are you? Oh, yeah, I'm fine, thank you very much. Said, keeping well? Oh, yes, fine, thank you. How's your husband? Wondering if it's a professional connection. He's like, oh, he's well. What's he up to these days? Oh, he's still king. And then he realizes that he doesn't actually know her. He just recognizes her photo from the newspapers. So anyway, Fortnum and Mason is the kind of place where wealthy English people still go to shop. You know, neither you nor I would be able to shop there on a regular basis, but it's a nice place to go for treats. And if you go down into the basement of Fortnum and Mason, you will find what English people call hampers, what you would call wicker baskets. And that's where the British elites used to go in the 19th century when their son Gerald was off administering half of India. And they would go and they would get a hamper and they would fill it with cheese, Stilton and wine and pate and so on, and then put it on a steamer out to India. And you can still buy these hampers and send them wherever you want. And indeed, when my family first moved here, every Christmas we would get a Fortnum and Mason hamper from my parents. They would send it across to us in the colonies over here just to kind of make sure that we didn't forget about England. Okay, so that's number 6. Number 7, be careful of plastic bottles. New environmental regulations in Europe as a whole and in England mean that those screw cap bottles don't screw off completely. So you undo them and then they're attached a little bit, which can sometimes make drinking a little hazardous or pouring a little hazardous. But don't think you've done something wrong if the cap doesn't come completely off. Typically it will fold over in some convenient fashion, but just be prepared. Maybe you'll watch some YouTube videos about how to drink from a bottle in Europe if that's what you're planning on doing, but it can be a little hazardous. Number 8, be warm. Well, sorry, 8 and 9 are if you meet any of the natives. I don't know whether you'll actually meet any British people where you're over there, but a couple of pieces of advice if you do. So 8thly, be warm but not too warm. English people are just a little bit more chill than Americans. If you're warm, they will respond warmly. But if you go give them a hug and pretend that, you know, they're your long-lost cousin, you know, and tell them that your name is Dobbs and you think that was from England and so on and so forth, they may start kind of getting a little overwhelmed because they're, you know, very kind of, you know, frightened people. So be warm, be yourself, but don't call them quaint. That word doesn't go down well. Don't call their villagers quaint. But be yourself, but just, I mean, you're from California, so you should be fine. Just act like your children or grandchildren do. Just that kind of slightly chill, laid back, yeah. I'm not going to say everything's on my mind, and you'll be absolutely fine. 9thly, you're going to encounter a variety of responses from English people. Some people who will love you because you're American, some people won't. Oh, well. Too bad for them, right? That's going to be the same anywhere you go. It's the same anywhere I go. So just be aware that, you know, if you bump into somebody who seems a bit grumpy, either it's because they're having a bad day or because they're grumpy. Somebody once said to me that English people sometimes can get a bit kind of uppity with Americans. As one English person once said, it's because we used to run the world, and now you do run the world, and we think that we could do a better job than you are currently doing of running the world if we were still in charge. So you'll be fine, but be prepared for a variety of responses. Don't be apologetic, and it'll be fine. And then 10thly, you leave in what, a couple of weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks? If you are the sort of person who listens to podcasts or watches television, just enjoy a bunch of British media before you go. There's a lot of it. The Jane Austen costume dramas are always good value for money. They're maybe not what I would recommend at this stage just because England isn't like that anymore. And if you've been fed a diet of Mr. Darcy in a wet T-shirt, you know what I mean. If you've seen the BBC 6-hour adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, and you go to England, you're likely to be very disappointed, especially as it never rains in those Jane Austen adaptations. More recent ones, there's a wonderful one that I like called Call the Midwife, about midwives in London in the 1950s. BBC show, and a rare bit of television that makes not only Christians, but nuns, would you believe it, look extraordinarily intelligent, powerful, competent, and compassionate. Like if you're in for some television that makes Christians look cool, Call the Midwife is excellent. If you want any leadership training, don't go to the gurus from Harvard who write the books you buy at airports. Just watch The Head Nun in that series, and you'll learn everything you need to know. So Call the Midwife is great. If you're more into crime drama, there's a wonderful series called Foyle's War, which is all about crime on the south coast of England during the Second World War. Foyle's War is really, really good. If you want a bit more modern Britain crime drama, Broadchurch, a bit more gritty. David Tennant, if you know him, but still very good. The podcast I'd recommend is called The Rest is History. If you don't like middle-aged Englishmen talking about history, then you won't like This Evening, and you won't like The Rest is History. But if you do like middle-aged Englishmen talking about history, The Rest is History is a fantastic podcast. Actually won Apple's Podcast of the Year last year. They do all sorts of wonderful things on all sorts of different history. They're just doing a series at the moment on the Elizabethan era, Francis Drake, Queen Elizabeth, Shakespeare, that kind of period, which I was enjoying on my way here this evening. So The Rest is History. They do everything from classical history to Nazism to the French Revolution. My family and I just went on a national parks trip up in Montana and Wyoming, and they had like a 8-part series on Custer and Crazy Horse and so on. So they do US history as well. So my 10th piece of advice for you is just enjoy some British media, of which there's a lot of good stuff. Or you can watch David Attenborough and his nature documentaries if you're more interested in animal photography. That would be a very good one. So, is this microphone okay, or is it buzzing? Are you all happy? Happy enough? Okay, great, super. So, any questions on any of that? Or any other suggestions from Americans who visited Britain, which I've never done? Watch your purse. Yeah. Good. Good, good, good. Good. Yeah. We will get to Evensong. There will be an Evensong plug coming soon. Yes, Fortnum, Fortnum and Mason. And if you're a gentleman, there's an excellent clothing shop across the way called Cordings, where you can go and buy trousers, as we call them, in 12 different colors. It's very exciting. You can get lime green trousers and orange trousers and all sorts of things. So any women who feel as though your husband's getting a little predictable in his sartorial choices, you can get something for your pastor. Pastor Eric, I think, would look good in a pair of salmon, pair of pants. So, yes, no, he does. You're not. Yes. Oh, very good. Okay. Oh gosh. Yeah. 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 Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, we've done that before. We went to Canada and got some maple syrup, and we came home without our maple syrup. So, yes, I can. It's on Oxford Street in London. It's one of the great historic London department stores. I went there about 5 years ago, and it's still very snazzy. It seemed to be very touristy these days. But yeah, I mean, it's lovely. And there's some nice architecture on some of those streets as well. Regent Street, I think, is a little nicer. But yeah, Selfridges, good place to go and buy yourself a new leather purse or fountain pen or something like that. So, or $800 pair of tennis shoes or something of that nature. So, okay. So, those are my tips. I have 5 more things that I want to talk to you about. Firstly, just a very brief overview of the history of Christianity in Britain since 1500. Secondly, I want to talk about some revivals in the church. Thirdly, going to church today, because I think you'll be visiting some churches on your trip. Fourthly, cathedrals. They deserve a special section of their own. And then fifthly, just some reflections more kind of socially and culturally on what is the state of the church in Britain today. Okay, so my understanding is that Pastor Eric has educated all of you about the Reformation in England. Yes? So you know Luther, you know Calvin, and you've probably heard about the serial marriage king, Henry VIII. England becomes somewhat Protestant. So, the Reformation, 1500s, is when the church divides into the Catholic wing, think the mission, and then the Protestant churches, think basically everything else, Methodist, Baptist, Covenant, Episcopal, they're all Protestant churches. And when the church divides in the 1500s, England starts going down the Protestant road. It's a little halting. You kind of have some kings and queens which switch around. But eventually, by the time you get to Queen Elizabeth, and this is kind of mid-1500s, England is, okay, we're going Protestant. Okay, we're moving in this direction. It's a little bit more, it's a lot more complicated than that, actually. It's important for you to know as Americans, as you probably already do, that there are a whole bunch of people in Britain who are a bit disappointed in the Reformation. These are the people we call the Puritans. The English Reformation does Protestantism turned up to level 7 or 8. And the Puritans who want it turned up all the way, right? They just kind of want to have it, full on. And when you have all these lovely cathedrals and when you have bishops and archbishops and all this kind of stuff, it's a bit difficult to just kind of have a completely pure, full-bore Reformation. And so the Church of England, which is the name that's given to the key core Protestant official church in England, the Church of England is definitely a Protestant church. Okay? But it's got a little hints of Catholicism here and there. Okay? Certainly all sorts of things going on which would be very different from what you would typically have in this church, right? If you came on Sunday morning and Eric was wearing a cassock and over the top he had a surplice and a dog collar and then a golden vestment and a mitre, you'd be like, where am I, right? And you'd be inclined to say, did I take a wrong turn and end up at Our Lady of Guadalupe on Montecito Street on the Lower East Side, right? But in the English church, some of those sorts of historic things, they inherit all the Catholic buildings, of course. They're not tearing them down. They've got all the stained glass, et cetera, et cetera. They do make some changes internally. But you're going to end up with this church which is doctrinally very Protestant, but is not as Protestant as some people want. And the people who are really gung-ho for Jesus often end up becoming Puritans and then often end up getting chased out of the country or leaving, okay? Over time, and Eric alluded to this earlier, there is going to be kind of a widening of what's acceptable. So if you have an English last name and your family lived in England in the 1500s, you would never bump into your friend on a Tuesday and say, where did you go to church on Sunday? Because there was only one church, right? It was the Church of England. That was the only option. By the 1700s, as Eric has alluded to, you start having what are known as nonconformist or dissenting churches. And they're the ones that are basically, that are Protestant, but they are in 2% of their theology or 5% of their theology, they're different from the Church of England, right? So Church of England would baptize babies. And then there'll be some Baptists who'll say, no, you can't do that, right? We're only going to baptize people after they've made their own profession of faith in Christ, right? Those sorts of churches over the course of the late 1600s, 1700s, they start being allowed, okay? So Baptist churches come in. Methodist churches before long are going to come in. Presbyterian churches are a slightly different kettle of fish because Presbyterians tend to come from Scotland. And the Church of England is the official church, the established church in England. Up in Scotland, you have the imaginatively and predictably named Church of Scotland, but that's a Presbyterian church, okay? So Presbyterianism is slightly different, but still, you do have this growing toleration of different Protestant groups over the course of the 1700s in particular. And then in the 1800s, they even start saying that Catholics might be okay again. For a long time, Catholics were deeply suspect people because the danger was always that they would be cozying up with the French or the Spanish and planning an invasion, which happened on numerous occasions. But the 1800s are the period where England more officially takes over the neighboring island of Ireland, which is chock full with Catholics. And so they're like, oh golly, what are we going to do? And so the 1800s are really the period where they start saying, well, guess it's kind of okay if you're a Catholic too. But for many, many years, if you weren't Protestant and if you weren't a member of the Church of England, you were kind of out of luck. You know, you couldn't be a member of Parliament. You couldn't go to Oxford and Cambridge for many, many years. They were the only two universities in England. And in order to go there, you had to be Church of England. This is why Isaac Watts couldn't go there. Even up to the 20th century, if you wanted to go to study at Oxford, you had to pass exams in Latin, and you had to be familiar with the text of two of the Gospels in Greek, and they would examine you on this. And there was a Bible knowledge test. I don't know whether Mark Nelson said this about C.S. Lewis. There was also a mathematics exam. And C.S. Lewis might never, did he talk about this? Might never have actually been a student because he couldn't pass this darned maths exam. But because of the First World War and he'd served in the First World War, they changed the rules a little bit and he managed to sneak in. But if it hadn't been for that, he never would have got his degree. Okay, so because of this link between the Church of England, because it is the established church and it's linked to the authorities, the Church of England often ends up becoming elite-dominated. If my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather had stolen something and was hauled up before the magistrate for petty theft in, let's say, 1815, he might well have found that the local magistrate was actually also the local clergyman, right? There was a strong link because of the established church between the church and the state, the church and the legal systems of England. One of the things that this means over time is that the Church of England is going to do it's not going to do as good a job of holding on to peasants, to the less educated, to the less well-off. They are often going to be the people who dribble into the Baptist churches, the Methodist churches, and so on and so forth, where they're going to be allowed to be elders, right? Or they're going to be allowed to preach, or whatever it may be. So this link between the established church and the wealthier elites of British society is going to be one which, in the longer term, arguably, is going to be a bad thing for the health of the English church. Okay. As I said, attendance is compulsory for a long time. By the time you get to 1850s, it's down to about 50%. Mid-19th century, about half the country goes to church on any given Sunday. By the time you get to the year 2000, it's down below 10%. And that's not insignificantly lower than would be the case in the United States today. The United States is a bit of an outlier in terms of a wealthy Western country that still has high church going. All the other wealthy Western churches have low church going. But we'll talk more about that later. But over time, you definitely have a decrease in the number of people going to church. One of the heydays of the church is kind of the late 1800s. This is when Britain is ruling the world, the most wealthy, the most powerful country in the world in the second half of the 19th century, more or less up to the First World War. A couple of things that you start seeing during that period are, number one, a very strong missionary tradition. So lots of missionaries going out from Britain to places like India, places like China. Some of you have heard of James Hudson Taylor and the China Inland Mission. If you read missionary biographies, you've almost certainly heard of him. He's a Scottish doctor who founds that. So strong missionary tradition. Also a fair amount of Christian nationalism. So there's a lot of kind of, we're the best country in the world because God has made us great. Woohoo! Praise God for Britain. When Britain is no longer the most powerful country in the world, that kind of quietly goes away, if you like. But certainly at the time of the First World War, you definitely had bishops and others who were very prepared to say, God is on our side. We are a Christian nation. Rah, rah. Let's fold our hands in prayer and wave the flag at the same time. That was definitely a part of British Christianity. I mean, one of the funny things, I'm writing a book at the moment about the British Conservative Party and Christianity, is when you get to the Second World War, which is more obviously we're fighting Hitler here, so we're fairly sure that kind of maybe God is on our side, right? It's kind of a bit more morally clear-cut. The clergy in England have been so burned by the experience of the First World War, where so many people said, God is on our side, and then they were like, hang on a minute, let me read my Bible for a second. This doesn't quite seem to match up. We need to be more careful here. Then when you get to the Second World War, they're kind of like, well, it's complicated, don't know, At least they're not quite so gung-ho from the pulpit in terms of their willingness to say that, which is kind of an interesting quirk of history. Okay? So that's kind of hopefully gives you some overview of what's been going on in the English churches since 1500. But that was, kind of 80,000 feet up. Any questions, anything that you want clarification? Yes, Colleen. Nice to see you. Yeah, very good. And have you read much Jane Austen? Yeah, so this is where you get it from. So you've got all these little churches up and down England. And in order to be a vicar of the local church, you have to have trained, typically at Oxford or Cambridge, to be a vicar. But then who appoints you? Who's the search committee? And it really varies. But in many cases, the people who appointed the vicar were the people who owned the land in that area. Right, so hence the Mr. Collins figure, if you know him in Pride and Prejudice, who's very kind of, sycophantic, watching his P's and Q's, sucking up to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, because Lady Catherine de Bourgh is his patron. She's the one who pays his salary, as well as having gotten him the job in the first place. So that's really helpful, because that's another way in which the clergy often find themselves on the side of the status quo, rather than on the side of the poor. There wasn't always that way. Most of the kind of poor relief, so for the destitute and so on, that got handed out in Britain until the mid-1800s is coming through parish churches. And people could always just go to wherever their parish church was and say, help. And the parish church would often help. It's a wonderful book that was written recently that was looking at all these letters that people had written when they were in need. One of the things that you will all understand was many of these letters came from painters who would write to their parish and say, I'm a painter and I'm 40 and I'm losing my mind. And as you know, we painters don't live long. They had no idea where they didn't know why they didn't live long, but everybody knew that if you were in that business, you were going to probably go doolally and then have an early death. And so when they were asking, please support my wife, please support my children, they put, I'm a painter, and as you know. And as we know, it's lead poisoning, which led to that. Hatters were another job where you'd get ill very quickly because they used arsenic to get the felt to stand up on the hat, hence the Mad Hatter. There were lots of Mad Hatters who had kind of a greater or lesser degree of arsenic poisoning, which I have no such excuse, unfortunately. But any other questions? Yes? Sorry? An Anglo-Catholic. We'll come to them in just a moment. You're ahead of me, as usual. Okay, so secondly, let's talk about some revivals, of which the Anglo-Catholic is going to be one. So church history always is a bit like this, right? It's up and down. There are times when there's renewal in the faith, and that has certainly been the case in British history. And there's been a series of revivals over the last 300-400 years, three in particular that I want to introduce you to briefly, which will help you understand the church in England today. Because you could go into a 15th century building in England today and it says St. Andrew's Church of England Church on the outside. And inside you could find very different things going on. In terms of the creed, it's exactly the same. It's all, Christian. But there are different streams, different traditions within the Church of England that these revivals help create, okay? And this is different from the United States. The history of Christianity in the United States has more typically been, let's just go start a new church, right? If we don't like these people down the road, we'll just start a new thing. And if we disagree, we'll be this different Presbyterian church, and it's all good. That doesn't happen so much in England for a range of different reasons, not least these beautiful buildings. Why would you want to leave those behind, right? And so you have these different revivals within the Church of England and within the nonconformist churches, and I'll mention three briefly. Firstly, in the 1700s, you have the evangelical revival, And you as good Americans will all know about this because this is the British equivalent of the Great Awakening. So think Jonathan Edwards, think George Whitefield, think John and Charles Wesley, think the founding of the Methodist Church, okay? This is the tradition out of which the Evangelical Covenant Church comes through a variety of steps along the way, okay? Evangelicals, there's a variety of things that characterize them. I'll just mention three really briefly. Number one, they preach the Bible. If you went to an evangelical camp growing up and they said to you, if you want to grow as a Christian, you need to read your Bible every day, that's evangelicalism for you, right? If you go to a church and the sermon is longer than 20 minutes, it's an evangelical church. If you go to a church and the sermon is shorter than 15 minutes, it's not an evangelical church. How long do you preach for typically on a Sunday morning? 60? Okay, but 30 minutes? Okay, yeah, so it's an evangelical church, right? Because Eric believes, the elders of your church believe, if this congregation is going to grow, it's going to be the word of God that's going to help you grow. So evangelicals love preaching. The second thing is evangelicals really believe in personal conversion. Okay, again, if you went to a camp growing up where on the final night they give you an opportunity to pray a prayer to receive Jesus into your heart, that's classic evangelicalism, right? Billy Graham rallies, come down to the front at the end. That's classic evangelicalism. God has no spiritual grandchildren. You have to make your own decision for Jesus. And the third one is action, right? I teach at Westmont. Westmont is chronically underfunded despite Ron Kronk's sound financial management and best efforts. Why is Westmont chronically underfunded? Because evangelicals don't really believe in thinking very much, right? They're all about action, right? So when, Community Covenant Missions Committee is thinking about where should we give our money, they're thinking poor relief. They're thinking evangelism in El Salvador. They're not thinking we should give money to Westmont because it's really important that we have thoughtful Christians, right? In a way that the Catholics do, right? Hence these great institutions like Notre Dame and so on and so forth. Anyway, so evangelical revival, emphasis on the preaching of the Bible, emphasis on personal experience of God and personal commitment to God and action, whether that be social action or whether that be evangelism. Really, really important. Great Awakening is 1700s. There's another kind of, there are more evangelical revivals along the way. There's an important one in the 1800s. Some American preachers like Dwight Moody, who I'm sure you've heard of. He came over to Britain, was an important preacher in kind of an evangelical Renaissance movement in 1800s in England. But within the Church of England, but also within, say, the Baptist churches of England, the spirit of evangelicalism is very much alive and well. Okay, so if you moved to England permanently from this church, you would be able to find churches in England which would be very, very similar in character. Okay, and to give you a couple of names that you may be familiar with, who would be exemplars of the evangelical tradition in Britain in recent years. John Stott would be one, you may have heard of him. N.T. Wright. These would be evangelical pastors in the Church of England. They would be evangelical Anglicans, right? Anglican is the adjective that goes with Church of England. So people like Stott, people like N.T. Wright would be evangelical Anglicans. The second type of revival you had, and this was a bit of an odd one, and you were just referring to this, is there's a Catholic revival in the Church of England in the 1800s. John Henry Newman is the name most associated with that. They are interested in reconnecting the Church of England with its Catholic roots. So the Church of England always, in a sense, says we trace our roots back to Jesus and to the apostles, right? And for 1,500 years, the Church in England was in communion with Peter in Rome, right? Until the break in the 1500s with the Reformation. And so the Catholic revival is, let's kind of get back to that spirit. And we'll talk a little bit more later about what you'd find if you went into a Anglo-Catholic church, as they're often known. So you have the Catholic Church in England, where they're going to say, we love the Pope. Then you're going to have, within the Church of England, you're going to have Anglo-Catholic churches, which are Anglican churches which smell a bit Catholic and look a bit Catholic and are a bit Catholic, but they're still Protestant Church of England sorts of places. Okay? We'll talk more about Anglo-Catholicism a little later. The third type of revival is what I think is probably best, a Pentecostal charismatic revival. So this is 20th century. This is Los Angeles, actually. The Azusa Street revivals in LA in 1905, really, really important moment in the history of the church over the last 125 years or so. So you have Pentecostal churches like the Assemblies of God, etc., which come into Britain. You also have a charismatic renewal movement within the Church of England. In the 1960s, it starts in the US in an Episcopal church in Van Nuys. There's an Episcopal church there, which is a very significant part of church history, and then spreads to London and radiates from there. But Pentecostals, charismatics, strong emphasis on the gifts of the Spirit, gifts of healing, speaking in tongues. There are charismatic and Pentecostal revivals in the 20th and 21st centuries as well. And if you're looking for something to hang your hat on there, many of you will have heard of the Alpha Course, I'm guessing. It comes out of Holy Trinity, Brompton. Brompton is an area of London. You can go to that church if you're in London. That's a charismatic Church of England church. Okay? So Nicky Gumbel, Sam Miller, all these sorts of people are charismatic Anglicans, right? John Stott, N.T. Wright, evangelical Anglicans within the Church of England. Nicky Gumbel, charismatic Anglican within the Church of England, just influenced by these different revivalist streams through the years, okay? And what that means, and I'll pause for questions again in just a moment, and this is kind of my third heading. If you pop into a church in England today, you're just going to find real variety in the same way that you would obviously in the United States. If you wander into a Catholic church, you're going to get a traditional Catholic Mass, and that's probably what you're going to get. If you wander into a nonconformist church, like a Baptist church or a Methodist church, it will probably feel fairly similar to this. Okay, the chairs may not be purple, but they'll probably be soft, and the building probably won't be particularly old or particularly ornate, but it'll be comfortable. But if you go into a Church of England church, which would be the majority of churches, all bets are off, right? You could go in. The first thing to do is take a deep breath, right? And if you all of a sudden smell wafts of incense, then you know you're in an Anglo-Catholic church of some description, right? They're swinging incense. It's one of the things the Anglo-Catholics like to do, which, is a thing which typically you wouldn't have in a Protestant church, right? I doubt that they're doing incense here on a Sunday morning. But Anglo-Catholics within the Protestant Church of England will have what are called smells and bells, right? It's kind of, all sorts of interesting practices going on. That's where you're going to have the best outfits too, in all likelihood, right? So if you're a young person going into ordination in the Church of England and you like fashion, Anglo-Catholicism is probably where you want to be, because you get to wear all these cool clothes and different colors depending on the year and so on. You might wander into a Church of England church. Again, from the outside, look exactly the same. This is stone. It's been there hundreds of years. And you go in, and they have chairs like this. They've ripped out the pews, and everybody's doing this. And, there's a guy at the front with a beard and a guitar. And, it's a charismatic Anglican church. And they are, they're in that renewal tradition within the Church of England. Or you might go into a church and there's a lot of people dutifully sitting there with notebooks and pencils, and somebody, typically a man, occasionally a woman if you're lucky, but probably not, giving a sermon that just kind of goes on and on. And then you've stumbled into an evangelical Anglican church. Sometimes they have pews. Sometimes they've taken the pews out. They've probably made it more light and airy. But yeah, going to church in England, like if you just kind of randomly, just one Sunday morning, just kind of go down the street randomly walking into churches, it's kind of, mystery pick and mix. You don't quite know what you're going to find, but you are going to find, I think, typically people who are very sincere about their faith. I think living here in California, one of the things we probably do is kind of look a little askance at the Bible Belt. You know what I mean? Kind of, well, everybody goes to church there, but it's just kind of cultural, and we're not quite sure exactly how much they believe. I mean, some do, but when everybody goes to church, are they really going for Christ, or are they just going to have a nice time and sell insurance, right? Is that fair? Is that unfair? Do Californians tend to think that, right? Fewer people going to church here, but there's a sense of maybe we're more sincere about it. Is that fair? Yeah. That's how Europeans would see the church. The way that people in California might be tempted to look at Oklahoma or Texas is going to be how people in Europe will look at all of American Christianity, right? You've got less than 10% of the population going to church. So if you go to church, it's just a pretty countercultural thing to begin with. So the question is, why are you going? Older people go at higher proportions than younger people. But certainly if you're under 50, the question really is, why on earth are you here on a Sunday morning rather than in bed or paddleboarding or whatever else you might be doing? And so the churches you go to will typically be pretty earnest, okay? I remember coming to this country and coming to church and just kind of being shocked, especially at how some of the youth would dress and behave. And I was like, this isn't what churches should be doing, right? They should, get the young people down and make them study the Bible. But it's like, no. We have to kind of keep them interested and keep them coming and have, bicycle events and things like that. Whereas, in the UK, we lived there for a number of years and we have lots of friends from there. The youth groups in those churches will tend to be much more devout, if you like, than the youth groups in the churches over there. So Christianity is very much alive and well in the UK. And I do hope that you have a chance to go to an evangelical church while you're there. Every city you go to will have some. There are some great evangelical Anglican churches. If you're in central London, go to All Souls, Langham Place, which is right there, just around the corner from Selfridges. And it's where John Stott preached for 50 years. And that is very Anglican, great building. But they'll sing Waymaker or whatever it is that we sing here these days. They might even have commas. And they'll have slides, and they will, have a sermon that you'd find pretty comparable, I imagine, to what Eric preaches, where they're going through the Bible and helping you to understand it. You should also go to some of the more formal churches where you're going to have liturgy, and we'll talk about that in just a moment with the cathedrals. But if you go to church in England, these are the sorts of things that you are going to tend to encounter. So that was revivals, and then how that spills out into the sorts of church experiences you're going to find if you go to a church in the UK today, which was the third thing I wanted to talk about. So we've done brief history since 1500. We've done some on the revivals, which give flavor to the church today, and then we've done going to church today. Any other questions on that? Yes, sir. That absolutely has, right? The faith keeps on getting handed down generation to generation. I mean, you should really be asking, Eric that question, how he deals with it, right? Because it's a very difficult question. And different churches at different times have dealt with it in different ways. So when Jonathan Edwards was pastoring a church in Northampton, Massachusetts in the 1700s, there was a big question, are we going to baptize all of the kids born into this church, or do we actually want to see signs of the Spirit at work in their lives? And that was a very divisive question. And it's very difficult. I don't think there are any easy answers. He'll. Do you want to comment on that, Eric, at all?
Well, I know in my perspective, from my perspective, I have certain spheres of influence that I have. The main one being here at church, and that's why my preaching is to the heart. And I assume that wherever I've preached and been, that there are people who are there for whatever reason other than their heart. And so all I can do is just try and call them in, invite them into the deeper life in Christ. That's the way I approach it as a local pastor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you've got the parable of the wheat and the tares, right? Yeah. And they both grow up together till harvest, and it's not up to us to go around going, wheat, tare, wheat, right? We just don't know. So, yeah.
How different is the Church of England from the Episcopal?
Very good question. There are definitely similarities. So doctrinally, they are pretty joined at the hip, not basically completely. My understanding of the Episcopal Church in this country is that for a long time, it was the church of the most educated and the most wealthy people in the United States, which is why if you look at which is the nicest Protestant building in town, it is Trinity Episcopal Church on State Street, right? And that wasn't the case in England in the same way. Here you had Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists. Episcopalians were kind of always, well, not always, but since the 1800s, certainly, they're very much a minority of American Christianity, whereas the Church of England is always going to be a majority of Christianity in England. So doctrinally similar, but socially they end up being pretty different. And so by the time you get to the mid-20th century, the Episcopal Church in the United States is really starting to lean pretty liberal or progressive in terms of some of its ethics. And there are some in the Church of England who are like, yay. But there are many in the Church of England who are like, no way. Whereas if you're like, no way, in the Episcopal Church, you just leave and find a different church. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think, I don't know enough about the Episcopal Church and wouldn't really want to comment on it. But doctrinally, they're still firmly Christian. They would still say the creed and so on.
A totally unrelated question. Are the priests in the Church of England, are they assigned churches? Do the bishops move them around? Or is it a case by case?
It's more case by case and it's more applying for jobs.
Okay.
So it's not like the Methodist Church sometimes has been where you kind of get moved every 7 years. It's more you network, you apply, you find a position, you get appointed, and then you move.
Okay. So when you have a charismatic Anglican church and an evangelical one or whatever, they continue to seek their next status
Exactly.
within that
Yes,
position.
very much so. So typically the people, whoever has control, and that can vary a bit, whoever has control of that church, the board, if you like, if it's in the Anglo-Catholic tradition, they're not going to go and appoint a evangelical to the church. They're going to find somebody who will continue that tradition. So, yeah, great question. Yes. Yeah, so you'd have a Methodist denomination, you'd have Baptist denominations. There's even a fellowship of independent evangelical churches. If you know David Martin Lloyd-Jones, he started out congregational and then ended up with this loose fellowship of independent evangelical churches. There's presbyteries. So yeah, they would be organized in denominations in a way that would be analogous to what you'd have over here. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, very good question. So the monarch is still technically the head of the Church of England, right? When you go to England, if you look on the money, you'll see probably a picture of Queen Elizabeth II, maybe a picture of Charles III if you're lucky. And there'll be various letters around the sovereign's head. Coins in England actually mean something, so don't just throw them away like in this country. You can't do anything with it, even a quarter these days, right? Where in England they'll have like a £2 coin, which is worth about $2.75 or something. So you need to come prepared to look after some coins if you go to England. But the notes, as we call bills, are much easier to deal with than the American notes, much better for elderly people than the American ones because they're not all the same size. The more valuable they get, the bigger they get, and they're not all the same color. So I think disability campaigners in this country have campaigned to say, our money's terrible for older people. And I think they made some concessions. Now the numbers are bigger than they used to be. You've probably noticed that, but it's still, it's neater in your wallet here. You just kind of got your stack of green things. Anyway, if you look at these letters around the Queen's head, you'll see the letters FD, are two of the letters, which stands for Fidei Defensor, which means defender of the faith, which is a bit cheeky because when Henry VIII was in his Catholic phase, this was he wrote a book, smart guy, wrote a book saying Luther's a complete heretic. And the Pope was so pleased with Henry VIII's book against Luther that he gave him this title, Defender of the Faith. And Henry was kind of like, well, I'll keep that. So even though he eventually rejects the Pope's authority, he keeps the Pope's gift of this title, and his successors have kept it ever since. So Charles III is technically Defender of the Faith and head of the Church of England. His mum, Queen Elizabeth II, was, by all accounts, a devout woman, and she would talk about her faith. Charles, much more woolly, wishy-washy. So he was interviewed, 30 years ago now, and somebody said, you have to be defender of the faith. And he said, well, I prefer to think of myself as defender of faith. Maybe it's Christian faith, maybe it's Muslim faith or whatever. So yeah, I think as the monarchy, up until Elizabeth II, so up until a couple of years ago, certainly Elizabeth II was pretty serious about that role, but not so much these days. But yeah, Archbishop of Canterbury is still really important. You can see his palace, Lambeth Palace, across the water from the Houses of Parliament and Big Ben, if you look out for it. So yeah, any other questions? Okay, a couple more things quickly, and then we'll have more time for questions at the end. Eric asked me to talk about cathedrals, which are in a special category. Everywhere in England is part of a parish. It's kind of, historically would have been a village, a small area with, a few dozen families and a parish church. That's why there are just hundreds of these, thousands of these churches up and down England, because every parish, walking distance, right, go back to medieval times, everybody had to have a church they could walk to. So you have all these little parishes, and then they're organized into dioceses, D-I-O-C-E-S-E-S, if you're taking notes, D-I-O-C-S-E-S, dioceses, which are kind of like a large group of churches. And over each diocese, you would have a bishop. So you'd have the Bishop of Lincoln, or the Bishop of Westminster, or the Bishop of Nottingham, or the Bishop of Bath and Wells, or the Bishop of, York, the Archbishop of York. And the cathedral was, in a sense, the center of the diocese. So think big church that's at the center of a region. Sometimes they map neatly onto counties. So, I come from Derby. There's a cathedral in Derby, which is the center of the county. And there's a Bishop of Derby. And then his patch, if you like, is the Diocese of Derbyshire, which is hundreds of square miles, right? It's a large area. It would be similar size maybe to Santa Barbara County, but with many more people. And there's a bishop over that place. And the bishop, in a sense, their home base is the cathedral, okay? And so the cathedrals have always been richer than other churches. They've typically been bigger than other churches. They've often been older than other churches. And they are either stunning or they're amazing. I mean, any chance you get to go into a cathedral, go. My father died a couple of years ago. In his retirement, before he died, he wanted to visit every cathedral in the British Isles. Just one of the things he wanted to do. Managed to do it with a couple of years to spare. Some of that was just because it allowed him to travel across the country. Some of that was because he loved cathedrals. He was a member of Derby Cathedral. Some of that, though, and this goes back to an earlier comment from Ron, is that the cathedrals are the heartbeat of one of the glories of English Christianity, which is choral music. So if you go to an English cathedral, my strong encouragement to you would be, don't just visit the cathedral, go to evensong, which is typically every afternoon at about 5 p.m., and there'll be a choir, and there'll be an organ, and you can just sit, and it's typically just a transporting experience. How many of you have been to evensong in an English cathedral? Would you agree? Yeah? It's just, anytime you can do it. It's also great if you're poor, because you can get into cathedral for free at evensong. Whereas if you go at other times during the day, they've got these amazing, it's very, very difficult. What would your church do if you happen to have the most extraordinary building in the county, and it was 900 years old, and therefore, if the roof springs a leak, it's just going to be millions to repair, right? Nobody can hear Eric, so you need a new sound system. Well, how the heck do you do a sound system in this stone building with vast vaulted ceilings? That's going to be another couple of, so it's a real problem for these cathedrals. And so during my lifetime, they started to charge tourists, essentially, to come in, just so they can help maintain these buildings and stop them from falling down. yeah, English choral music is wonderful. So that's something else you could do as you're preparing to go. Just type in Evensong to Spotify or something like that, and just get into the music. But these buildings just really are magnificent. The artworks in them are just amazing. I was at Norwich Cathedral with my mother, excuse me, last summer, and they have these bosses. So imagine a ceiling, and it's got these kind of vaulted stonework coming and meeting in the middle. And where they meet in the middle, you've got a boss, kind of a stone which holds it all together. It's about this big. And there are the cloisters outside where the monks used to be. I mean, these buildings have just got so much history. And then inside the cathedral, you've just got, you've got hundreds of these bosses. I mean, they're all individually painted and all got individual scenes, and they're just extraordinary. And that's just one little bit of one cathedral. Westminster Abbey, it sounds like you're going there. That's a creepy place, in my opinion, because they've got, Westminster Abbey is really weird because they've got all sorts of tombs to people who may or may not have been Christians. I think Charles Darwin is buried there, or there's a monument to him there. Handel has a monument in there. But they've also got, the tomb of Edward III, who died, in the 11th century or something. And you're just kind of like, ugh. It's kind of got this bag of bones in there that's been in there for more than 1,000 years. And it's just kind of sitting there. I mean, it's just one of the wonderful things that Britain hasn't been invaded really for a very long time. And the Americans and the British dropped more bombs on France in the Second World War than the Germans dropped on Britain. We all know about the Blitz on Britain, but actually there was significant damage, but it wasn't as much as the damage that was inflicted on countries like France and Germany. And what that means is the cathedrals survive. There's really only one cathedral that is knocked out, and that's in Coventry. But cathedrals are just amazing. You should go to Evensong. Very popular at Christmas. As I said, my father was involved with Derby Cathedral, and they, starting in the 21st century, they started to say, wow, we need to put on 3 Christmas carol service rather than just one, because everybody is like, well, not everybody, but a minority of people are like, well, it's Christmas, we should go to church. Which church are we going to go to? And they no longer really have a connection to their local parish church. So they're like, well, let's just go to the cathedral. That's going to be where the best show is, right? That's going to be where the best choir. If you go to a parish church, they probably don't have a choir. Or if they do, it's 4 ladies who, well past childbearing age, like, my Aunt Diana, who sang in the church choir for many, many years. But the cathedrals keep that tradition of English choral music going, and it's beautiful. And that's where you'll find the liturgy and so on. If you like kind of set prayers, if you like a service that takes you through the story of Christianity, you're going to get that in an Anglo-Catholic church. You're also going to get it in a cathedral. You might have an evangelical bishop, but the cathedrals are going to be traditional. You'll get the fancy outfits, you'll get the choirs, you'll get the organs. There'll be no slides. They'll probably give you some sort of service book that you have to decipher. But if you can kind of take a deep breath and think, this has basically been, this or something almost identical to this has been happening every day in this building for 1,000 years in many cases. It's just an amazing, back to your comment earlier, sir, an amazing testimony to the faithfulness of God to his church, that this just keeps going, which is phenomenal. So go to as many cathedrals as you can, though again, I do hope that you'll get to go to some sort of evangelical Anglican church while you're there, because that's where you're going to meet people like you. Does that make sense? Cathedrals, there's a few strange English people who go, but not many. Okay, let me just make a few comments on the state of the church today, and then we'll have a few minutes left for questions. So as I've hinted, there's many vibrant churches in Britain today. All up and down the country, all different sorts of churches, as you would have different types of churches over here. As fewer and fewer people have been going to church, it's been difficult to be the Church of England, the official church, the established church. Because some people in the Church of England have wanted to say, we need to continue to be a church for the whole people of England. And other people have wanted to say, no, we need to be a church that is for believers. Church is for people who have faith in Christ. It's not just for any Tom, Dick, and Harry. If somebody has never been, then that's not really our concern, right? What do you do if you're an Anglican vicar and parents come to you and say, we'd like you to baptize our child, and you've never seen them before? You sit down with them and you say, well, tell me a little about your story. Do you go to church? No. Oh, okay, so why do you want to have your child baptized? Well, we were baptized as babies. When was the last time you went to church? Oh, I stopped going when I was about 11. What do you do if you're an Anglican vicar at that point? Do you baptize the baby? These people over here would say, yes, we need any contact with English people we can get. These people over here say, absolutely not. No, if we're going to take the church seriously, it needs to be the people of God. That's what the church is in the New Testament. So it's very difficult to be the Church of England, and just trying to figure out how they're going to navigate this very different cultural setting in which they find themselves. Some of the things which are challenges for churches in England are similar to the ones that are being faced by Christians here. Lots of discussions around human sexuality, for example. What are we going to do about that as society becomes more accepting of homosexuality, for example? What's the church going to do about that? Those have been major topics of conversation among English Christians over the last several decades. One of the things which I think is healthy about the English church is neither the far left nor the far right really seem to have got their claws into the churches. So there definitely are some kind of far right groups in the UK today, and some, far left kind of groups. But the churches typically are like, no. We're not going along with that kind of stuff. So I think the English churches have done a fairly good job of navigating and trying to find a godly place that doesn't give in to shrill and alarmist voices either on the left or the right. There have been some signs of revival in the English church in the last couple of years. Some signs of young men, interestingly, especially coming back to church. There's some dispute about that, but it's definitely something which people have been talking about. The last kind of, I think, significant uptick in spiritual enthusiasm in Britain, you're probably looking back to the 1940s after the Second World War, honestly. And it's been kind of a fairly steady decline since then. But there's still lots of people like you and families like yours that are reading bedtime stories with their children. And you have to remember that, even if it is 7% of the population going to church on a Sunday morning now, that's still 7% of the population. It's more than going to football matches the day before, right? It's still one of the most popular, common things that English people would do in any given week. It's not what it was, but that doesn't mean that it isn't still alive and well. So that's all I have for you. I think we have 6 minutes left if there are more comments or questions. Yeah, Wales is interesting. So there is an established church in Wales too. It's separate from the Church of England, but so Britain, big island, Ireland, over here, right? Britain, you've got England, which is most of it down here, and then you've got Scotland up top, and then you've got Wales over here. It's kind of like the left-hand bit. England absorbs Wales pretty early. It kind of runs over Wales. England dominates Ireland for a long time. It takes over Scotland really in the early 1700s, and then it takes over Ireland formally in about 1800. And then in the 1900s, Ireland divides into two. If you follow the Troubles in Northern Ireland, you've got Northern Ireland, which tends to be Protestant. Southern Ireland, which tends to be Catholic. Okay? So if you look at my passport, I'm a citizen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. My mother's Irish, so I also have another passport, which is citizen of the Republic of Ireland. So there's a church in Wales. It's often seen as kind of a English imposition, and so there are a lot of people who want to resist the church in Wales. So the Methodist Church becomes especially strong in Wales as a non-conformist alternative to the Church of Wales, which is the established church, the equivalent of the Church of England, which also gives birth to what is often regarded as the longest word in the English language. Because in the 1800s, there are people who are arguing for the end of the official Church of Wales. So they're calling for the disestablishment of the Church of Wales. And the people who are against that are anti-disestablishment. And that movement of people who are against the disestablishment of the Church in Wales, the name of that movement is anti-disestablishmentarianism. So that's where that word comes from. So, any other questions? Eric?
The cathedrals, the evensong, are these choir members paid?
Very good question. Sometimes yes, especially if they're over the age of 13. So typically these cathedrals have schools associated with them, and there are choirs at these schools with young boys, and it historically and still today typically is all boys who with unbroken voices sing the soprano parts, which are beautiful. If you can get a boys' choir in your evensong, that's kind of extra special. But the tenors and basses often are paid, but I don't think that's, maybe it is always the case now. I'd like to think that it isn't. Yeah. It's a big commitment. Yeah. There's much less church splitting in England than there would be here. I think it's harder just to set up your own church. People will often leave and go to a different church. That would be common. But the Anglican church is, the pastor of the church kind of has a fair amount of grip. Not complete, but a fair amount. In the nonconformist churches, they're often elder-led, and so there are elder boards who kind of keep some of the personalities in check. So I'm actually struggling to think of a church split that I know about in the UK. I'm sure it's happened, but it's not. Here there's a much more kind of vibrant, let's do what it takes to reach the people, which is one of the reasons why the church, I think, is flourishing and larger in many respects than it is in the UK. One of the downsides of that is it can lead to oversized personalities and conflict between people who want to be the next great thing. Yeah. Are they in communion? And what do you mean by in communion? Yeah. Yeah, good question. They're definitely friendly. Same in the US, yes. I think most people living today are probably too young to remember the period where, denominations really, they were very important identities. And if you went to a different church, if I came here on a Sunday morning, Eric isn't going to say, no communion for you, young man, right? He's going to come on in, right? Whereas you go back to the 1940s, 50s, there would have been very much, if you're a Methodist, you're not taking communion at a Presbyterian church. What are you thinking? So there's definitely communion, I think, in that sense between Church of Scotland and Church of England. The ecumenical movement is what that would be known as. So, yeah. Last question, Colleen. Well, we're out of time, so there are people wanting to go home. Yeah, very good question. So the question of whether the Church of England in particular should ordain women to the priesthood was a very controversial issue back in the 90s. The Church of England decides that they're going to go for women's ordination. But there are people in the Church of England who are horrified at that. Two groups in particular, the Anglo-Catholics, because the Anglo-Catholics, they kind of want to be like the Catholics, and the Catholics obviously don't like women priests. So the Anglo-Catholics are like, I'm not sure we want women leading churches. And the conservative evangelicals, right, the equivalent of conservative American churches, which would say preaching is for men, those conservative evangelical Anglicans are also kind of horrified about the idea of women preaching or being priests in the church. So it becomes a very divisive issue, unfortunately. Yeah, you can read books and all sorts about that. Happy to chat more. So, yeah.
Would you join me in thanking Alistair Chapman for being with us tonight? Thank you very much for being here. So we have one more session next week. I'm going to need to wrap up some things so we're kind of going back and forth in the timeline a little bit, but I want to talk about William Tyndale next week. Because again, this is the 500th. Thank you, Brandon. This is the 500th anniversary of the publication of the 1526 New Testament out of Greek. So I want to talk about William Tyndale. I'm going to talk about a few other things, but then I want to focus on what happened in Scotland. Okay, so we're going to do that next week. Then we wrap it all up because the very next morning at 0:30, I'm leaving. So, okay, hope to see you next time. Thanks for being here. All right.